So what I was saying is that migrating embeds people in new power hierarchies, and this can impact their gender and sexualities. So for example, once somebody migrates, they can gain new information about sex. They can also start working, and that for women facilitates more egalitarian conditions within heterosexual relationships. And at the same time, in the United States, Latina immigrants become embedded in new power hierarchies that can hypersexualize them and can embed them in political economies that exploit them, and can also embed them in new citizenship hierarchies as they sometimes become undocumented. And so this research is really helpful. However, it oh sorry, the next thing I want to say is there's two studies that have documented how daughters shape generational negotiations, because much of the research on generational negotiations examines how mothers are talking to daughters. And so there are two studies on Latinas um, that look at how daughters teach their mothers. So there's one study by Jennifer Ayala that talks about how teen girls actually teach their moms that it's okay to date after they have been divorced, because there's stigma about dating after being divorced. And Aida Hurtado's study on college-going Latinas shows that once in college, these girls learn information about domestic violence, information which they then leverage to help their mothers leave abusive relationships. So building on this research on mobility and generational negotiations, I asked the following questions in my dissertation. So in this presentation, I will mostly talk about how I answer the first question, which is how does undergoing a mobility experience of going to college shape Latina's own gender and sexual subjectivities, as well as generational negotiations between daughters and mothers. So in this study, I used three methods. And so I used semi-structured interviews, and I began by interviewing 53 Latina college-going daughters or girls. The daughters must have met the following requirements. They must have been first-generation college students who currently or previously attended San Francisco State University, UC Davis, or UC Santa Barbara. They must have also called Los Angeles home and had a migrant Latina mother who lived in Los Angeles for 10 years. And so through interviews with the daughters, I recruited 11 of their mothers to interview. And as I was wrapping up the interviews, I recruited 7 girls or daughters to participate in a digital ethnography. And so basically, I gave these girls prompts to which they answered by taking pictures of their aesthetics. And I met with them both online and in person to talk about, why they took these pictures and what that meant for them. And so from this data, a lot of the 7 girls brought up the term hot Cheeto girl to talk about the decisions behind what they wore and what they didn't wear. And so in this presentation, which led me, which led me to add a discourse analysis of 78 TikTok videos that used the word hot Cheeto girl in the video description, or had hot Cheeto girl in as a hashtag. And so in this presentation, I'm mostly going to draw from semi-structured interviews with the Latina college-going daughters to answer the question that I just described earlier. So based on my conversations with daughters, I found that girls learned a lot of information about gender and sexuality while attending university. They learned this information through coursework, campus programming, social networks, as well as immersing themselves in queer culture and events. Many Latina college-going daughters reported learning about various reproductive health topics, information which they didn't readily have available at home due to the lack of comprehensive education in their schools. For example, Denise, who was an SF State alumna, talked about how she learned through campus resources and friends about safe sex and various sexual activities to explore sexual pleasure. She utilized this information to teach her mother about condom use as well as yeast infections. During one of our conversations, she shared, yeah, I talked to her, my mother, about condoms. We've talked about birth control because I told her that I use birth control. And sometimes when she has questions about birth control, then she'll come and ask. I know recently she had a yeast infection, but she doesn't want anyone to know because she's afraid they're going to think, oh, it's an STD or an STI. I get annoyed because I'm like, that's just so stupid. Based on Denise and my conversations with other daughters, I learned that girls talk to their moms about safe heterosexual and queer sex, which in this case consisted of Denise teaching her mom the importance of condom use and to differentiate between an STI and a yeast infection, as well as different birth control options. This is information that was not readily available to mothers as well because I learned through interviews with the moms that they were low income girls in Latin America. And because they were low income girls, they didn't get to go to school. And this denied them the opportunity to have access to sex education themselves. And once they migrated to the US, they became embedded within the political economy, and they also didn't have opportunity to go to school and gain access to sex education. Mm. Another common theme that I found was that girls learned about sexual pleasure, particularly how to embrace their sexualities through casual sex. And so some daughters try to encourage their moms to have to have casual sex, especially if their moms were single moms or recently divorced. This was the case with Aurora, who told me during our interview. So I tried to tell her, my mother, like I just feel like I'm like my own self, like I'm my own sexual agent. Like I can choose or not choose to do something with someone and just solely do it for pleasure, like it doesn't mean that I'm going to marry this person in 10 years. Like, I think sex meant different things for different generations. And I just kind of tried to teach her that it doesn't have to mean you're in a relationship or you're committed to someone and can simply just be sex, whether that's with a friend, whether that's just a stranger. And she laughs, and I'm remembering the moment, so I'm laughing too. It happens. So, Aurora was one of the daughters that attempted to teach her mother about casual sex. This is a really important finding because I interpret this as an invitation for Latina immigrants into sexual pleasure. And this is important because sexual pleasure is systematically denied to low-income Latina immigrants within the US because it often relegates them to being passive desexual objects that are meant to produce capitalist wealth, or it reduces them to hypersexual objects that exist to fulfill someone else's pleasure. So in either instance, whether they're reduced to passive desexual objects that are supposed to produce capitalist wealth or hypersexual objects, the pleasure and agency of Latina immigrants is missing. But the daughters are trying to teach them and invite them into centering their own bodily pleasure. And lastly, the another finding was that the daughters learned a lot about queerness, and they learned about various sexual orientations, about gender fluidity, about differentiating between biological sex, gender identity, sexual orientation. And so they tried to share this information with their mothers as well as other family members. And so this occurred with Sol, who drew on her knowledge that she learned in college to talk to her mom about sexual orientation and the fluidity of gender. She says, with my little brother who came out to us, I started talking a little bit more about terms. Like, that's what I mean. I say certain things sometimes, like, Mom, my brother's gay. And it's hard for her to say stuff like that. I do try to inform them because then they're like, oh no, is he trying to be like, is he transgender? I'm like, no, he's just fluid in the way he dresses. And so I'll kind of educate them in that way when we're talking about my brother. And sometimes even when we're like watching a movie or something and they're like, confused and like, what? I don't get it. I'll kind of use what I know. So it was common for daughters to share information with their family members about queerness. This is also really important because, as I mentioned earlier, I found that mothers didn't have an opportunity to gain comprehensive sex education. And so, because of this, they didn't have the opportunity to learn about queerness. And through conversations with the moms, I learned that their lack of silence about queerness or non-binary folks wasn't necessarily evidence of them being homophobic or transphobic. It was more about their lack of knowledge. And so I think that the daughters see this gap in the mother's knowledge and they invite them to learn these terms that they have also learned. And I know I have about a minute left, so just some concluding thoughts. Firstly, just to reiterate, college, it's typically, at least in the US, the way it's studied is that it's a mobility trajectory that's only shaping class formations. And while it is shaping class formations, it's also shaping gender and sexual formations, as I have shown, right? It shapes the gender and sexual subjectivities of college students, as well as generational negotiations that students are having with family members. I particularly focused on Latina college going daughters and their migrant mothers. But as I talked, right, or as I showed, it also impacts the conversations that the daughters are having with fathers, also with younger siblings, younger cousins. And some even talked about how going to college and the knowledge that they learned was going to inform how they became a parent. And so I can't possibly answer all those research questions in my study. So there is definitely more research that is needed on this topic. Thank you so much. This is my email, and that is my Twitter or X handle, whatever you call it nowadays. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And I'm going to introduce Jade to start sharing her screen. And for folks, if you have questions like for each of the presentations, then just put them in the chat and then we can get to them after, just so we don't forget, because I know I always do. So, okay, great. Jade, go ahead.
Thanks, Hallie. Hi, everyone. My presentation is on romance and sexual desire in the millennial teen film. So before the invention of the motion picture, the novel was largely responsible for circulating stories of romance and courtship. In the 20th century, however, Hollywood assumed the role of master storyteller. At the turn of the millennium, teen films, particularly those targeted to teenage girls, were rife with stories of romantic love. These films naturalized the connection between love and sex, perpetuating the idea that girls' erotic desires are bound to romantic intimacy and monogamy above sexual fulfillment. The glorification of true love in millennial teen films assumed that girls' sexual pleasure cannot exist outside of romantic love, cementing long-held gendered myths about female sexuality and desire. In constructing girls' sexual pleasure as inherently tied to romantic affection, these representations conversely implied that teenage girls who have sex outside of a committed romantic relationship are slutty and sexually immoral, stigmatizing teenage girls who fail or refuse to conform to traditional gender ideals. These films had a considerable influence on the sexual socialization of millennial teenagers, especially teenage girls, and the construction of female sexuality in the late 90s and noughties. The teen romance genre, or true love narrative, was one way Western popular culture at the turn of the millennium sought to control the sexual appetites of teenage girls. Millennial teen films continue to perpetuate stories of love and romance, teaching young women of this generation to exercise sexual restraint or risk social condemnation, abnormalizing their sexual pleasure and desire outside of a romantic relationship. The romance narrative idealized sentimental romantic love, portraying it as the essence of a successful intimate relationship, reinforcing traditional heterosexual gender relations and denoting what is and is not appropriate behavior for young women in relation to the opposite sex. These romantic teen films institutionalize seemingly normal or natural ideas about femininity, sexual desire, and compulsory heterosexuality. During the late 90s and into the 2000s, there was a revival of young, naive romance in teen films such as Clueless, 10 Things I Hate About You, She's All That, Save the Last Dance, and Twilight. These teen films sought to target adolescent female audiences by tweaking adult romance narratives to focus upon the amorous lives of teenage girls. These tales of teen romance idealize the notion of one true love through the romanticization of courtship and the sentiment that true love conquers all. This included true love triumphing over differences in social status, personality, cultural background, and race, such as in Crazy Beautiful, Save the Last Dance, and Step Up. The notion that romance and true love can transform a person and complete them is a dominant theme throughout the Twilight series, for example, as it is in many other teen films of this generation. Girl teen films like Twilight, for example, sever the link between romance and sex. Like an 18th century romance novel, these romantic tales are passionate and full of lustful desire, yet chaste. The poetically gushy dialogue and starry-eyed romance of Twilight allows young girls to revel in the eroticization of it all while remaining sexually uncorrupted. While most millennial teen films did not overtly preach abstaining from sex until marriage, as in Twilight, they did still set clear boundaries for the expression of girls' sexuality and desire, providing teenage girls with limited condoned pleasure. These stories of love and romance, although rife with emotional sentiment and young girls yearning for intimacy, often failed to include any serious consideration of teenage girls' sexual desires. Instead, these films taught teenage girls that only romantic love will lead to pleasurable sex, simply by virtue of the emotional connection between two people in love, and that girls should wait until they find their soulmate to experience or indulge in sexual pleasure. In Save the Last Dance, for example, Sarah and Derek are shown kissing and undressing and presumably have sex, although off screen. This is acceptable within the millennial teen film universe because the sex takes place within the context of a meaningful romantic relationship. By treating teenage girls' wish for romance as inherently natural and correlating sex with emotional intensity, these millennial teen films suggested, sometimes explicitly, that teenage girls who reject the idea of romantic love in place of purely sexual or non-monogamous relationships are abnormal, thereby teaching millennial audiences that for young women, sexual desire should only be explored in a committed romantic relationship. The true love narrative also played a significant role in representations of virginity loss in girl teen films of the new millennium. These teen films, while again not necessarily preaching abstinence, did continue to moralize the loss of virginity for teenage girls. The gendered construction of virginity in teen films reveal that girls' bodies and her sexuality is strongly regulated by a strict set of moral rules. Being in love and in an emotionally intense romantic relationship takes on a marriage-like function in these films, reflecting wider cultural opinion at the time that premarital sex is acceptable for young women as long as they are in a committed romantic relationship with their sexual partner. True love replaced marriage, both in film and broader society, as the obligatory prerequisite for young girls' virginity loss. Like Cher in Clueless, saving herself for Luke Perry, young women of this generation talked about their virginity as a gift they were saving for Mr. Right, though not necessarily a husband. Romantic love and finding your soulmate, rather than simply marriage, is central to millennial narratives that idealize the first-time experiences of teenage girls. Often romanticized and overly sentimental, millennial teen films told us that if a girl loses her virginity, it should only occur within a meaningful romantic relationship to someone with whom they are deeply in love. These representations of virginity loss shape the sexual interactions of millennial teenagers, teaching them very limited, socially appropriate ways in which to be sexual, and suggested to young people that to defy such gendered norms risked negative social connotations. Sex, for young women, still had to be coded as romance for it to be socially acceptable at the turn of the millennium. Millennial teen films assumed, and indeed reinforced, the idea that teenage girls desire romantic intimacy, monogamy, and love above sexual or erotic pleasure. The sexual desires of teenage girls tended only to be seen as relevant in millennial teen films within the context of romantic love, or alternatively, as an object of male desire, thus perpetuating the myth that girls do not want sex, girls want romantic intimacy and a relationship. In teaching young women that normal teenage girls desire romance above sexual fulfillment, true love narratives stigmatize those girls who fail or refuse to conform to such conservative gender ideals. Thus, young women are to exercise sexual restraint or risk their reputations and future as only good girls find love and happiness. Our happy ending, of course, being contingent on finding romantic love, as millennial popular culture taught us. While teenage boys who have multiple sex partners are represented in the millennial teen film as getting experience, teenage girls who have multiple sex partners are depicted as easy. Girls who engage in casual sexual relationships are often represented in these teen films as having a bad reputation or as someone fun to fool around with, but not someone you would ever date or marry. For example, in Premature, Rob can only end the time loop he is stuck in when he finally loses his virginity to the right girl, his friend Gabrielle, and not Angela, the sexy school slut. These messages further stigmatize girls who have sex outside of a committed monogamous relationship. The school slut may be sexy, but her overt sexuality and sexual attainability means she is not desirable in the long term. This virgin whore, good girl, bad girl dichotomy presents itself in several millennial teen films. Sorry, I was just reading the comment. Presents itself in several millennial teen films where the good girl is presented as innocent, modest, self-denying, and naive, while the bad girl is represented as a scheming, ambitious seductress. The good girl is sexually desirable, but does not have any sexual desire, while the bad girl is sexually attainable and has sexual desires of her own. It is the good girl who is culturally valued and idealized. The cultural distinction between the chaste, virtuous girl and the sexually deviant girl is critical to society's insistent denial of young female sexuality and sexual desire. This dichotomy is explicit in Cruel Intentions, where the two archetypal girls are pitted against each other. The film's villain, Catherine, is overtly sexual, manipulative, callous, mean, unsympathetic, and addicted to cocaine. Her powers of seduction, sexual expression, and blatant sexuality are intended to evidence her depraved nature. Catherine's ability to use her sexuality as a weapon is portrayed as dangerous and ultimately leads to her downfall. While Catherine is punished for her sexuality, virginal Annette, who is humble, chaste, polite, and virtuous, is rewarded for her sexual restraint. In the end, it is Annette who experiences great love, is finally happy, and is elevated to hero status. For the teenage girl, both her femininity and morality are at stake when she is labelled promiscuous. Although the word promiscuous itself is gender neutral, it is rarely used colloquially to characterise men who have transient sexual encounters. Promiscuity is a word that has come to refer almost exclusively to females who have had multiple sexual partners outside of an exclusive relationship. Unlike the teenage boy, the teenage girl risks being labelled a slut or easy and being shamed for her sexual conduct or for giving it up under the wrong circumstances. One millennial teen film that is often praised for shining a light on cultural slut shaming and the labelling of what young women as promiscuous for engaging in casual sex is Easy A. Sorry. Here we see how even one or two sexual encounters can earn a girl a reputation of being easy. The theatrical poster for the film reads, "The rumour-filled, totally false account of how I ruined my flawless reputation." The film's lead character, Olive, does not actually have sex, but she does lie to her best friend about losing her virginity to a college guy. When the leader of the school's conservative church group overhears that Olive has lost her virginity, she spreads the story around the school. Olive also pretends to have sex with her friend Brandon at a party so that he won't be bullied anymore for being gay. After these two encounters, Olive's good girl image is ruined and she gains a reputation of being easy and a dirty skank. While teen films during this period no longer blatantly equated the sexually liberated teenage girl with the prostitute, in less overt ways, promiscuity was predominantly constructed in mostly negative terms. As such, young women were told to control their sexual urges and only express their sexual desires when appropriate, or risk being socially ostracized. Girls of this generation were just as vulnerable as ever to being labelled and shamed for expressing or acting upon their own sexual desires. In millennial teen films, we see girls who enjoy casual sex being represented as slutty and their sexual activity shamed or treated as immoral. Catherine articulates this perfectly to Sebastian in Cruel Intentions when she says, "It's okay for guys like you and Court to fuck everyone, but when I do it, I get dumped for innocent little twits like Cecile. God forbid I exude confidence and enjoy sex." Here, Catherine not only calls out the double standard between male and female sexuality, she also alludes to the possible risks young girls face if they do not conform to social expectations of femininity. Teen films, like all media, both create and reflect reality. At the turn of the millennium, Hollywood played a significant role in constructing youth culture and female sexuality. At the same time, these films can be seen as reflective of the wider sociocultural context, reinforcing gendered and sexual biases that already existed outside of the narrative space. Nevertheless, the ways in which girls do sex, have sex, and are sex are clearly constrained by a strict set of rules. These rules play out in the millennial teen film, particularly in romance narratives, which idealize true love and bind teenage girls' sexual desires to romantic intimacy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jade. That was awesome. I can't wait for our conversation after. And then next we have Allegra. If you wanna.
Yes, let me share my screen. Mhm. Okay. Oh, screen sharing is paused. Sorry, I'm having some issues. Maybe because I'm using two screens, so just give me one sec. Mm. Okay, now can folks see my screen? Amazing. Great. Okay, so I am going to be talking about pleasure and play as safety, and it's an exploration of, there we go, an exploration of fat girlhood in Lisa Phipps' Starfish. So as was said earlier, my name's Allegra. My pronouns are she, her, and I attend York University in Toronto as a master's student. So I'm just going to get my notes up on my other screen. There we go. Okay. So in Lisa Phipps' middle grade novel in verse, Starfish, 11-year-old Ellie's experiences of bullying from her peers and her family show the reader the realities of living as a fat girl in America. Ellie does have one place where she feels safe, though, her backyard pool. In my paper, I'm going to discuss Lisa Phipps' exploration of fat girlhood in Starfish and how Phipp uses play and pleasure in swimming to explore the concept of safety and safer spaces for people with marginalized embodiments, namely, in the situation, fat girls. I will bring in literature on fat futurity and fat girlhood, including Carla Rice's 2007 article in the Women's Studies International Forum, which I have found to be a great resource in my exploration of fat girlhood within my studies. I will also include aspects of autoethnography in my paper, drawing on my own experiences as a fat girl who continues to live in a fat body today. So the book was originally published in March 2021 and is Phipps's debut novel. So we can see here, it reflects a lot of Phipps's own experiences growing up as a fat girl. So we can see here a photo of the author now as an adult. This is an image of the cover of the book. So Ellie, the main character in the book, kind of starfishing, as she calls it, in her pool. And then this is a photo of the author as a child. And so this photo is from an interview that the author did with the Washington Post, which I'll talk a little bit about that interview in it and some quotes from it in this presentation. But before I dive into the text itself, I do want to offer a content warning that I'll be discussing experiences of fat phobia. I know this can be difficult for those with experiences of fat phobia and body shaming to hear and to listen to, so please ensure you take care of yourself in any way you can. I also want to remind you, as Ellie learns and as I have learned, like, your body does not define you, and also being fat is awesome. So you know, I'm very big into fat acceptance and fat liberation. But it's also okay if you're not there, and take time to look after yourself. Okay, so in Starfish, 11-year-old Ellie navigates the fat phobia that she faces from her peers and her family, much of it starting when she's 5 years old at her birthday party. And this is where her older sister gives her the nickname Splash after she excitedly jumps into the pool. This nickname haunts her and implicitly gives permission to her peers to begin their incessant bullying for years to come. Although Ellie's peers are some of her worst critics, the ultimate bully that she faces is inside of her home, her mother. Ellie's mother is a familiar figure for many people who grew up fat. She is constantly critiquing Ellie. She weighs her weekly. She puts her on diets. She criticizes her body, and she makes Ellie feel unloved and undeserving of care and happiness. As the book progresses, more and more is revealed about the treatment Ellie's mom has been putting her through for years, from controlling what she eats to suggesting bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery, to picking her apart in a mirror piece by piece, asking Ellie if she was ashamed of herself for how she looks. Although her mom may not recognize the harm she is putting Ellie through, noting at different points how she believes these actions are a form of protection for Ellie and not a form of abuse or harm, the way that she scrutinizes Ellie's every move makes Ellie feel like she needs to make herself smaller and smaller, except when she's in the pool. So I relate to Ellie in that I have been in a fat body for my entire life. Although my weight and size have fluctuated, I have been in a smaller fat body, what some people will call like a mid-fat body. Um, I have always been in a body that has received criticism from those around me, including from peers and family members. Similar to Ellie, one of my first clear memories of being othered for my body size took place in my backyard in a bathing suit. So I'm going to show you folks a photo of me. So this is my own unfit fat girl experience. So this is a photo of me at around 9 or 10 at a restaurant with my late grandfather. So this is my grandfather, this is me, and these are my two younger brothers. Despite this big smile, I mean, I definitely had overall like a lot of happiness in my childhood. I know at this age I was already feeling uncomfortable in my body. That discomfort began years before, often coming from or inspired by peers in my elementary school and family members who often body shamed me. Another way I am like Ellie, and I think this is important to note, is that I am a white woman, and of course, I was a white girl. Although my fatness and other aspects of my identity have led to experiences of marginalization for me, I recognize that my experiences are not the same as racialized fat folks, and that much of the fat phobia in general in Western culture is steeped in anti-Black racism. A good resource for folks who are looking to explore this further is Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by sociologist Sabrina Strings. Starfish, the book I'm going to be talking about, Ellie's experiences and my own experiences are colored by growing up in cultures that are white supremacist in their roots. And therefore, the book cannot speak to the experiences of all fat girls, especially those whose experiences of oppression and fat phobia are also informed by racism and other forms of marginalization that Ellie and I do not experience. So although I did not grow up with an in-ground pool, I had two close friends and neighbors who did, and I spent a lot of my childhood summers splashing around with them in the water. The fat shaming memory for me that I mentioned earlier and that I'll go a little bit more into today, right now, it was not one of those days. I was instead at my parents' house in the town I grew up in on a hot summer's day, and my mother had invited over a work friend of hers and that friend's children. And so we were in the backyard playing water games, playing in the sprinkler. I think we had a little blow up pool, that kind of thing. At one point in the day, I remember talking to my mom about wanting to wear a bikini like her friend's daughter. My mom, who was a former fat kid, who also struggled at the time with internalized and external fat phobia and continues to struggle with this, told me that bikinis weren't for kids like me. Although I can almost guarantee she doesn't remember this day, and I think it's important to note my mom has made a lot of strides in recognizing fat phobia and in herself, like internalized fat phobia, as well as in the world around her. The idea that I was different and that my body couldn't do what other kids could really stuck to me like a piece of gum on my shoe that just didn't want to come off. It really colored my experiences in my body for years to come. The memory itself isn't as clear as day to me anymore, not as it was, over 20 years ago when it happened. But what I can still feel viscerally is the way that I was made to feel less than because of my body size. Unlike Ellie, who recounts the fat shaming at her birthday party as if it was yesterday, this memory of mine is clouded. It's in shame, in feeling othered, and in the pile of years and years of fat phobic comments I've received from family, from doctors, and from peers. And as Phipps has stated, both in her interview with the Washington Post, as well in a similar piece in her author's note in the book, everything hurtful that happens to Ellie in the book is things that happen to her, the author, in some way. For many fat people, even those who spent parts of their lives, especially their childhood as fat, they may feel the same way. I know that I did. I felt very seen by this book. So I am going to get into the fat girl rules, and before that, I'm going to introduce the Carla Rice article that I discussed earlier, as I feel it fits well with this So Carla Rice explores the idea of fat girlhood in her 2007 article, Becoming the Fat Girl: Acquisition of an Unfit Identity. And this article explores the unfitness fat girls feel through interviews with adults who identify themselves as former fat girls. Some of these adults are still in fat bodies and some are not. Many of these experiences include descriptions of mother-daughter relationships and encouragement of dieting from mothers, which created this sense of failure in the girls to fully qualify as girls. This sense of a failed and unfit girlhood is explored throughout Rice's article, with one participant noting that she wasn't what a girl should be. This transgression and discomfort in the girl identity for Ellie in the book just leads her to creating her fat girl rules. So Ellie's fat girl rules are rules that she has learned or created to attempt to protect herself and keep herself safe, and are mentioned throughout the book. The first rule she mentions on page 9 concerns the 5th birthday party bullying and swimming, a rule that goes beyond the confines of the pool and into her daily life. And so I have that here. Fat girl rules I learned at 5. No cannonballs, no splashing, no making waves. You don't deserve to be seen or heard, to take up room, to be noticed. Make yourself small. And so, while working with a therapist later in the book, Ellie shares her fat girl rules with someone else for the first time. After reviewing the rules between the sessions, Dr. Wood, her therapist, works with Ellie to explore why she uses these rules and how Ellie feels they support her in keeping herself safe. As Dr. Wood discusses the rules with Ellie, asking her for what Ellie states is the first time anyone's ever asked her what she wants instead of what society wants, Ellie struggles to answer this. Eventually, she says all she really wants is for people to accept her as she is instead of trying to change her. When Dr. Wood asks Ellie to describe herself without describing her size, Ellie struggles, and Dr. Wood says to her, "The problem with your fat girl rules is you've let them not only decide how you're going to live, but also define who you are." At this point in the book, we see clearly how Ellie has so fully internalized people's judgment and criticism that she struggles to see herself beyond this negative description. These rules are an attempt to keep herself safe, but they also limit her in exploring who she is beyond her body and beyond how others perceive her. She is simply fat, she is simply bad because she is fat, and she cannot see beyond this narrow definition that has been created for her. And so there's a lot of pain that Phipps demonstrates in the experiences of transgressive girlhood in Starfish, but there's a lot of joy as well. Ellie finds a particular sense of freedom in the space that she sees as a source of much of her pain as well, her parents' pool. This is a space where she learns to take up space, where she can work through emotions when she feels bullied, and where she can learn to open up to others, namely her new neighbor and eventual friend, Catalina. Although much of the negative self-image Ellie has internalized came from experiences within and around the pool, she also discovers a sense of safe pleasure and play within this space. Near the beginning of the book, on one of the first pages, she notes she feels weightless and limitless in the pool, and later says that it is her escape, it's her place. On page 34, where she has the poem, I Am a Starfish, she uses the metaphor of a starfish for the first time to describe how she feels in the pool. After returning from a positive plus-size shopping boutique experience with her dad, one of her main allies throughout the book, she goes swimming. And these are 2 excerpts from that page. So page 34 in the book, she says, "The pool has always been my escape, the place I feel weightless in today's fat-obsessed world." But as she floats, she spreads out her arms and legs and says, "I am a starfish. I'm taking up all the room that I want." Shopping with her father at this plus-size boutique allows Ellie to see other possibilities of a fat future. In a 2018 essay in the Fat Studies Journal regarding fat futurity, Michelle Byers discusses how contemporary YA novels create a space for fat future. In this article, she analyzes how These novels create a space for a future that emerges from reimagining the fat body, of embracing new ways of knowing the self and the world, and offer a politics of hope about fat bodies and their futures. At this point in the book, Ellie has already established the pool as her safe place to escape and play, with this new hope for a brighter, hopeful future that has been provided to her by the shop owner at the plus-size boutique Diana. She begins to use the pool as a safe space to explore pleasure within her body. She breaks her own fat girl rule from the beginning of the novel and takes up space. She spreads out and she becomes a starfish. Catalina, the daughter of a Mexican-American family next door, is a friend that Ellie bonds with over feeling othered and like an outsider. But unlike Ellie, Catalina comes from a supportive family who do end up embracing Ellie as well, inviting her to join them in celebrations like Thanksgiving and showing her that food can be a source of connection and pleasure as well, instead of fear and hostility. There is a part in the book where she invites Catalina to join her in the pool. I know I need to wrap up. She creates this space, she makes it a bigger space as a place to play. And so just to wrap this up, at the end of the novel, Viv, Ellie's longtime and newly long-distance best friend and fellow fat girl, Catalina and Ellie swim together in the pool. And she tells them about starfishing, which is this part on the screen. Starfish is a novel that I wish I had access to growing up. It follows Ellie as she discovers that fat phobia is not the only choice for her, and that a fat, hopeful, pleasurable future is an option. Although the book is limited in its representation of diverse experience of fatness, I do still believe it is a book that holds power in that it can show young fat girls and all fat kids the future of pleasure in their body can exist without losing weight. Ellie, myself, and all fat people deserve to take up space. We deserve to starfish. Thank you so much. And this is where to find me. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I can drop this in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allegra. What a beautiful ending that was. Yeah, lastly, to close out is Darlene Scott. So Darlene, go ahead.
Great, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, perfect. So, hi everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Girlhood Collective. Thank you, everybody, for gathering in this space because I think this is important work. I came upon Girlhood Collective by mistake. I think it was last year, it may have been the year before, that I came to a conference and I just happened to see it on Twitter somewhere. I'm not really sure how, and I knew I had to come back, so I'm back. Today, I want to talk a bit about the collection of poetry that I'm working on. It's called Invitations Not to Be Denied, which you see on your screen. So I am a multidisciplinary artist. So I do poetry and literature. So I'm a writer, a scholar as well, and a visual artist. So some of the visual art that you'll see in here will be my own. But in any case, I study corporeal presentations of trauma in all of those realms or all those genres. And I'm really interested in when I say corporeal presentations, I'm talking about the quotidian movement of the body and how it represents or how it presents trauma, even if we don't necessarily see it. And I'm especially interested in Black girlhoods because I was once a Black girl, not quite anymore. And so in this collection of poetry, Invitations Not to Be Denied, I'm really considering Black girl pleasure, the politics of Black girl pleasure, and it comes from its origin story is that it comes from a visual art series that I did some years ago around 2016 called Tropism. Now, when I create, whether it's literature or whether it's art, I don't have an answer to my question. So there's something that I'm questioning. In Tropism, I was trying to figure out how good girls of color navigate identity because typically when we talk about the good girl, that is not a role that would be assigned to Black girls in Black girlhood. I don't see my screen. Do you guys see my screen?
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, we don't see it.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. there we go. So I'm on slide 2. Um, in any case, to go back to what I was saying, the invitations not to be denied, it's originated with visual art. So before it became this scholarship and particularly this poetry collection, it was from a collection or series of art, mixed media art about the good girl and how the good girl, specifically the Black good girl, would navigate an identity not typically assigned to her. So tropism, the name, comes from the organic phenomenon of growing in the direction of an external stimuli. So when I think of good girls and I think of Black girls being assigned that role, I recognize that they probably are not going to grow in the direction, in their own direction. It's going to be how they are defined outside of themselves. When I'm thinking, invoking this good girl, I'm thinking of Carol Clover's final girl trope. Um, so the definitions of good girl and her definition of the final girl, for me, they are pretty much the same. So Carol Clover says that there is a final girl, the girl who survives at the end of the horror film. And that final girl always has these same qualities, essentially the qualities of what we would say would be a good girl. So she's androgynous, probably in name and aesthetic. So her name might be something like Bobby or Tommy or something like that. She's smart and witty and she's chaste. So when other girls are out making out or hanging out, she's in the house studying. She's doing her work. That's what makes her smart for one thing, and that's also what protects her from harm. That's the most important part. She's protected from harm by being essentially desexualized. Everything that would make her sexually available or sexually interesting is kind of stripped from her identity, as you've heard. So when I'm thinking about the good girl, that's what I'm thinking about. But I recognize too that there are not a lot of Black good girls that exist or final girls that exist in horror films. But when I was looking at what am I saying when I say good girl, I think that those two come together. Invitations examines how race and gender complicate pleasure for these good girls. But of course, when I got, or maybe not of course, but when I got into invitations, I realized I wasn't just talking about good girls. I was talking about girls broadly, and particularly Black girls. And I was noticing that they are not protected from harm, even if they were good girls or otherwise, because they can't fit into that kind of role. So my question became for invitations not to be denied, what do they do instead of or in spite of this stripping of agency, essentially to locate their agency? Because I knew for certain that there were places in which they were finding pleasure and experiencing pleasure. When I say Black, and I'm about to go to the next slide, I want to be clear that by Black, I'm asserting African descended people in the United States. So I know Black could be diasporic. I'm looking at only one aspect of the diaspora, particularly Black descended female people in the US, although I recognize, and I was noticing this morning in the presentation I went to, that this can apply to African descended females throughout the diaspora in varying and connected ways. And so Black female identity construction is where I essentially began my search for what I was looking for, the answer that I was looking for. The construction of Black female identity begins in, and that's why I gave that definition of what I mean by Black. It really begins with the first colony, the founding of the first colony here in the United States. That is the Jamestown colony in Virginia, which is, I don't live in Jamestown, but I live in the state of Virginia, right? And so that history is all around me. In 1619, 20 to 30 enslaved African people were brought to the colony, to an area called Fort Comfort, which is, if you're familiar, Hampton, Virginia, right? And so when they were brought, remember we're talking about a settler state, a settler project. So the colony is still under British rule. Under British rule, the parentage of a child, the status of a child followed the parentage, the father, right? And so when we bring these enslaved people, we have to start to identify what their what will be their status and their relationship. One of the first laws that was created in this new colony was in 1662. The statute is called the Law of Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which literally means the offspring follows the womb. So, in other words, the children of enslaved women would follow the status of their mother, regardless of how those children were conceived. And we know that many enslaved children were conceived through rape and other sexual exploitation, including breeding. This is significant because it goes against British law, right, in which the offspring typically follow the parentage of the father. But also in my conversation, it tells me who a Black woman or a Black girl can and should and would be. Black female persons are stripped of their personhood, both their female personhood and their humanity in general. In other words, they are made capital, and anything they produce are now capital, right? In other words, the exploitation of their pleasure happens. That is to say, their sexual pleasure is now also part of their labor. So it is stripped of them in that regard. And they're denied protection because they're no longer human and they're certainly no longer female. So they're not protected from these kinds of sexual exploitations either. And then their pleasure is policed as a result of this. So that pleasure, that policing of pleasure, which is something we'll talk about how that appears in contemporary times, comes with who they can marry, for instance, how they must appear, which is something that we're talking about even to this day with the Crown Act, like how a Black woman can wear her hair in corporate spaces and so forth. So by pleasure, I'm looking at Dr. Cornell West's definition when I'm defining it. So yes, I'm talking largely about sexual pleasure in this work, but really about pleasure broadly, especially when we're talking about girlhoods and Black girlhoods. So Dr. West says that pleasure is essentially an assertion of agency, an assertion of one's somebodyness. Now, again, to reiterate, we know that Black women in their construction, Black girls and Black women in their construction did not have somebodyness. They were simply capital, right? And so when we see them perform pleasure, when we see them perform desire and so forth, then we see them asserting their somebodyness. How this persists today is in several ways. So we see it, and when we think about Black girlhoods, we see it in their aesthetic presentation. Some of the aesthetic presentation, which I think it was Michelle spoke about, the Hot Cheetos girl aesthetic, which, as we know, is assigned, she was speaking about, to Latino girls as well, right? But that's a very specific aesthetic that asserts themselves. We could talk about what that looks like, but in any case, that's one of the aesthetics that Black girls use to assert themselves. My generation was called the B girl. The B girl comes out of the hip hop culture, right? And so that was a very specific aesthetic of Black girls in which they assert themselves. And there's a contemporary one that I've been following. Dr. Yaba Blay talks about the professional Black girl, which is also an aesthetic of Black girlhood that they use to assert themselves. And when I say aesthetic, I'm talking about the way that they appear, but also, which leads us to the next one, is their linguistic codes. In linguistic code and the way that they speak, we often hear the language, the vocabulary, even the way of speaking appropriated in other cultures. In any case, we know that for Black girls, it is a way of asserting themselves. We also see it, particularly for Black girls, we see it in their games. So you've ever seen them do the hand games they do. Miss Mary Mack was the one I grew up with, but I think they're very different now, like Uchi Wally Wally. But in any case, those kinds of games are ways, those kinds of linguistic codes, I should say, are ways in which they assert themselves and practice pleasure. And then in their intentional movement, which is something I think that Dr. Ashley Green Wade is going to talk about in her presentation, possibly, but it's certainly something she talks about in her book, Black Girl Auto Poetics, which we see in TikTok. By intentional movement, we're talking about social dance, for instance. We see that with Camille Brown's work, Linguistic Girl, Black Girl Play. But we also see it in something I grew up with, again, which was something that was called switching. It was an exaggerated movement of the hips for girls, often seen as adultifying, like an adult behavior, or that they were being fast, but in fact was just simply a way of girls, Black girls in particular, asserting themselves. These pleasures are often pathologized and policed, which is a part that I really wanted to get to in the text, having experienced some of these policing and pathologizing techniques. When we talk about pathologizing, we often see Black girlhood and Black girls, these behaviors being adultified and hypersexualized, like I was talking about with the switching. So the exaggerated movement of the hips, or perhaps the vocal tone that Black girls assume that might be a little bit deeper and might not be as soft a voice, are often adultified. This little girl is being fast or grown. That's what we see inside of the community. Outside of the community, that pathologization might look like some of the rules that which I'll get into with the policing that Black girls are expected to follow, that make them acceptable in their community and outside of it. So girls who run parallel to the Jezebel trope in their behavior are adultified. And when I say run parallel to it, that means that they speak in a way that suggests that they have sexual knowledge that they probably don't have, that they dress or look a certain way that suggests that they have this knowledge that they don't necessarily have, and again are called grown or fast. But if they act outside of this hypersexualization, this adultification, they're also considered subnormal, somehow different, somehow not a Black girl. And so this is yet another way of pathologizing their behavior. It's important to note that they cannot desexualize themselves, though. So they can't decide to be back to the good girl. They can't decide to be that. That is something that is assigned to them outside of themselves, and it's often used to make them safe. So if we think about historic tropes like the mammy is desexualized, that is stripped of her sexuality in order to make her safe in a certain environment. So from my own experience, I remember being considered a good girl because I was in um, academically gifted classes and that sort of thing, and because I did speak with a softer voice and so forth. So as a result, I was safe in the area, in those communities in which I was kind of actually the outlier, but to make me safe, I couldn't be like the other Black girls around me. In terms of the policing of their pleasure, we often see this in over disciplining of Black girls. So one of the Monique Morris writes about this in Push Out. But one of the ways that I think about it, there was a study done in Washington, D.C. that allowed girls to talk about their experiences in public schools, particularly with regards to dress codes. Oftentimes, the dress code would police those aesthetic styles that we talk about that were indigenous to them, right? And sometimes when they weren't indigenous to them, it would just say, this skirt looks different on you than it looks on a little girl who doesn't have the same body shape as you. And so you must go home and change. So we see them being over disciplined by application of these kinds of codes. We also see regulations that happen in their lives. That regulation we see Sadia Hartman writes about in Beautiful Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiment, when she talks about the turn of the century, girls moving to the north at the turn of the century, particularly to Philadelphia and New York, and how some of their behaviors would be regulated and policed. Behaviors like if they lived together, they would be considered as possibly moving into depravity of some kind, or if they stayed out too late, or if they hung their clothes on the line and their clothes included their underwear, this would be considered depravity and they would be arrested or fined for these kinds of things. And then we see lastly, the normalization is part of the policing, and that goes again back to the community. So inside of Black communities, we often see this sort of normalization of the pathologies. That is to say that respectability looks and sounds a certain way is to pathologize when it doesn't look that way. And so vocal tone is policed, intentional movement, like we were talking about, is policed, and you're not supposed to do it if you're going to fit into respectable bounds. So I do believe, like I said, my question was, where do they find this agency? Because I not only believe, but knew from my own experience that in fact they did find liberation and agency through their practices of pleasure and their seeking of pleasure. And so some of the examples that came to mind were examples of characters that were part of my youth, like Penny Proud from the Proud family, who I think asserts the aesthetic agency, the vocal agency, and so forth. Moesha, which goes back a little bit further, who Brandy played in that TV show. And then more recently, Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl, which is the precursor to Insecure by Issa Rae. So there was a YouTube series called Misadventures of the Awkward Black Girl, in which Issa Rae essentially plays herself. That series became the Insecure series that we see on HBO. But in any case, none of these are necessarily about sexual pleasure per se, but they do demonstrate Black girls and Black women honoring their pleasure and honoring their agency. I found invitations for myself to be a bit of a love letter. I think it was Allegra who was saying I was reading this book and recognizing myself in it. And that the author was saying in the book, I wrote the book that I would have liked to read. Well, as I was writing Invitations Not to Be Denied, I was also writing to my Black girl self, to my younger self, and to the Black girls like my nieces in this picture, who are coming up under me, who are my legacy. And I was writing to them about having their own agency, and having that agency, I want them to be able to proclaim their identity, whatever that identity is. So if that identity is a girl, is a good girl, or if that identity is something different than that, whatever their identity is, I want them to be able to proclaim it, announce it. I also want those of us who have moved a bit beyond girlhood to be able to reclaim, if we pushed it aside, if those respectability politics caused us not to act, and ultimately to be able to surrender to our pleasure, whatever that pleasure might be, and not feel policed even in our adulthood by it. So the next slide is the little girl me that I was talking to, but also shows you some of the references that I was referring to in this conversation. Camille Brown's Black Girl play is a Broadway production, so you can see clips of it. She also has a TEDx talk about it. Kyra Gaunt has written a book, but this is the article that I was using from about Black Girl play that I think is really good. And of course, Sadia Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And ultimately, I hope that you will be able to see my book, my collection of poetry anyway, in publication in the coming years, as it is now out to publishers, and my fingers are crossed that they will like what I have to say. So thank you all for coming to follow me. You can follow me on my socials, Instagram and Twitter or X. I'm Darling Anita Scott wherever you look. So wherever you go, you're going to find me in that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you so much. I love the sharing of references after. That's like top tier. Okay, great. So we have we're gonna push it a little bit because we have that flexibility. So we have about like 7 minutes for questions. If folks can put it in the chat or can raise their hand and unmute, that would be great. We can get some questions going. Great. So we have a question from Barbara in the chat. Hi, Barbara. A question for Jade. Having just seen Bottoms recently, I was reminded of the late 90s and early 2000s films that maybe don't fit the quote true love hetero courtship model you identify. How do you fit more independent films like 13 or Debs or But I'm a Cheerleader or Ghost World into this picture? Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so my area of research is actually around censorship and regulation of images. So I do talk about those films that you mentioned, like 13 and But I'm a Cheerleader, as films that counter the popular narratives that are put forward in kind of the more popular Hollywood produced teen films. So you have the kind of the millennial teen film, which fits this clean Hollywood sanitized kind of version of the teen universe, and then you have other films that are more like independent releases that came out at the same time that counter this narrative put forward, and those films do offer a queer perspective and a kind of criticism of these kind of romanticization of teen love. Absolutely. And Bottoms I still haven't seen, but Bottoms is absolutely on my list. I know. I have to see it, and it's on my list. So I'm looking forward to watching it.
Okay, thanks so much, Barbara. From Kristen in the chat, all of your presentations were incredible and had me thinking about the role shame plays when girls are confronted with or attempt to move away from controlling images. I'm curious how you see shame within your work, and this can be a question to anyone. So I wondered if anyone thought about that or has any comments on how shame kind of plays in this.
I can go if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that shame plays a huge role in both Starfish, but also in studies about fat girlhood and honestly like transgressive girlhood overall. And I think that in Starfish specifically, and in my work with the text, You can see Ellie pushing back against the shame that she has been received, and she does this in large part by having allies who help her push through that shame. And so her father, who I didn't get to speak too much about, but is a good ally to her for the most of the book, as well as her friends and members of their family or families. And so I think that shame is something that is not helpful and can get us stuck in a position where we feel like we have no way out, or where there's no way to change, or there's no future. And there's no future without changing, I guess. And I think that's what you're speaking to with the control aspect. But I think that is how that pleasure and play comes into play, I guess, in that it fights back against the shame.
Great, thank you. I mean, we have a little bit of time. I have a question. I'm not seeing anyone. Apologies if I'm skipping your question. I'm like, let me ask mine. Um, for Michelle, I had wondered, there's a lovely, got me so many overlaps between all of them. There's a lovely overlap between Michelle and Allegra in terms of like intergenerational, and a little bit of Darlene's at the end with like how you're articulating it with your nieces, this intergenerational relationship. And I was wondering, Michelle, in your research, this is a curiosity, were the mothers receptive over the knowledge that their daughters were sharing? Because I had wondered about what that might, the going, the reverse, what you highlighted hasn't been covered. So I wondered if, what was that negotiation a little like?
Yeah, I would say they're receptive to some things, and to others they're not. So I overall did find that the mothers were receptive to learning about queerness. Um and they were receptive to information about reproductive or sexual health. What they were a little bit less receptive to was their own exploration of sexual pleasure. So for example, having multiple sexual partners, or like sex toys, because some of the daughters would talk to them about sex toys. Um, and yeah, so that's something that, based on my conversations only with the 11 moms, that I got a sense of. So I mean, I'm just thinking about all of our presentations and how we're all kind of examining like access to sexual pleasure. And I mean, I think it's a lifelong process to be able to access sexual pleasure. And yeah, so that's my answer to your question.
Great. Yeah, no, very true. Any last questions, or any questions from our panelists? We have time for one more. We can ask each other questions. What do I have on here? Any more? Last call. Okay, well, then that's great. If anyone has any last questions, we're gonna hang out. I'm gonna hang out, put it in the chat, and I'll save it for them. But thank you so much again. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for folks who are here. And next we have our wonderful keynote that I know we all are super excited about. Dr. Wade is going to be here talking about her new book. And so we hope to see you there. So thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.